By the late summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht appeared invincible. To the eyes of a world watching in breathless terror, the Soviet Union was not just losing a war, it was being erased from the map. Operation Barbarossa had already torn through the vast borderlands, leaving a trail of shattered divisions and burning cities from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The German soldier, hardened by campaigns in Poland and France, believed he was a part of a machine that could not be broken. But beneath the surface of these spectacular victories, the first cracks of a systemic collapse were already beginning to spiderweb through the German high command. The prelude to the assault on Moscow was defined by a fatal hesitation. In August, Hitler had diverted his primary strike force away from the Central Front to secure the grain of Ukraine and the industrial hubs of the south. While this resulted in the massive encirclement at Kiev, it cost the Germans the one thing they could not afford to lose: time. By the time the Führer turned his eyes back toward the Russian capital, the golden light of summer was fading. The operation was given a name that suggested an unstoppable force of nature. It was called Typhoon. Operation Typhoon was designed to be the final, decisive blow of the war in the East. It concentrated nearly 2 million men, over 1,000 tanks, and a massive portion of the Luftwaffe's remaining strength. The goal was simple but monumental. They were to encircle and destroy the remaining Soviet armies in the central sector and seize Moscow before the first snowflake touched the ground. On the morning of September 30th, the German engines roared to life once more, and for the first few days, it seemed the gamble would pay off. The initial tactical successes were staggering. Using the classic pincer movements that had become the hallmark of the Blitzkrieg, German panzer groups under Guderian and Hoth carved through the Soviet lines at Vyazma and Bryansk. The scale of the disaster for the Red Army was almost beyond comprehension. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in two massive pockets. It was a loss of manpower that would have forced any other nation on earth to sue for peace immediately. In Berlin, the press was told that the war was over and that the Soviet Union was a mere corpse waiting for burial. But as the German columns pushed deeper into the Russian heartland, they encountered a structural failure that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The German logistical system was designed for a short, sharp campaign on the paved roads of Western Europe. Russia, however, was a landscape of infinite space and primitive infrastructure. The further the Wehrmacht advanced, the more its supply lines stretched and frayed. The rail gauges were different, the bridges were often too weak for heavy tanks, and the sheer distance began to drain the momentum of the offensive like a slow bleed wound. Then, the weather intervened. In mid-October, the first rains of the autumn began to fall. This was the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. The Russian soil, a rich black earth, transformed into a thick, viscous glue that swallowed trucks to their axles and horses to their bellies. The lightning war, which relied entirely on speed and mobility, ground to a literal halt. Tanks that had once covered 50 miles a day were now struggling to move 5. Fuel was burned at an alarming rate just to keep engines from seizing in the muck, and the German infantry, already exhausted from months of marching, began to feel the first gnawing doubts of the campaign. Inside Moscow, the atmosphere was one of controlled desperation. As the German spearheads drew closer, panic briefly flared. On October 16th, government offices were evacuated, and rumors spread that Stalin had fled the city. Thousands of civilians crowded the railway stations, trying to escape the path of the juggernaut. It was the lowest point for the Soviet capital. Yet, in this moment of systemic collapse, a grim resolve began to take hold. Stalin stayed. He ordered the city to be held at all costs, and the NKVD took ruthless measures to restore order. The defense of the city was handed to Georgy Zhukov, a man whose nerves were as cold as the Siberian winds. Zhukov realized that the Germans were overextended and that their strength was being bled dry by the very ground they sought to conquer. He began to organize a defense in depth, utilizing hundreds of thousands of Moscow's civilians, mostly women and elderly men, to dig hundreds of miles of anti-tank ditches and trenches. These unsung heroes worked in the freezing rain and mud, creating a physical barrier that the exhausted German divisions would have to break through, yard by agonizing yard. As the mud began to freeze in early November, the Germans saw it as a blessing. The ground hardened, allowing the panzers to move again. But the frost brought a new, more lethal enemy. the German High Command, in its supreme hubris, had failed to issue winter clothing to the troops, believing the war would be over by October. Now, men were fighting in summer uniforms as the temperature began to plummet. Oil in the tanks thickened into sludge, firing pins on rifles shattered in the cold, and thousands of soldiers began to fall not to Soviet bullets, but to the silent, creeping death of frostbite. On November 7, Stalin made a psychological gamble that would change the course of the war. He held the traditional military parade in Red Square to commemorate the October Revolution. The German lines were only a few dozen miles away, yet the Soviet troops marched past the Kremlin and straight to the front lines. It was a message to the world and to the Russian people: the Soviet Union would not fall. The parade infused the defenders with a sense of destiny that contrasted sharply with the growing despair of the German soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes. Tactical disasters began to mount for the Wehrmacht as they reached the outer suburbs of Moscow. The narrowing front meant that the German advantage in maneuverability was gone. They were forced into a frontal assault against a prepared and determined enemy. At the village of Khimki, a German reconnaissance unit reportedly reached a point where they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. It was the high water mark of the Third Reich. They were so close they could see the prize, yet they were utterly incapable of reaching out to take it. The German soldiers were now at the end of their physical and psychological tether. History records the harrowing accounts of men trying to start tank engines by lighting fires beneath them, and of surgeons forced to perform amputations without anesthesia because the medicine had frozen solid. The systemic failure of German planning had left the finest army in the world to rot in the snow. They were a ghost force, a shell of the army that had crossed the border in June, now facing a rejuvenated enemy that was about to reveal its greatest secret. While the Germans were freezing, Zhukov was quietly massing a massive reserve. Thanks to the intelligence provided by the master spy Richard Sorg in Tokyo, the Soviet High Command knew that Japan would not attack from the east. This allowed Stalin to move dozens of fresh, well-equipped Siberian divisions across the Trans-Siberian Railway. These troops were experts in winter warfare, equipped with skis, white camouflage, and the legendary Tiva-34 tanks, which featured wide tracks designed to navigate the snow. They were the silent hammer waiting to fall on a German army that thought it was only fighting a dying remnant. On December 5, 1941, the hammer fell. In temperatures that had dropped to 40 degrees below zero, the Soviet counter-offensive began. The Germans, paralyzed by the cold and stunned by the appearance of fresh divisions, were thrown into a chaotic retreat. For the first time in the Second World War, the Blitzkrieg had not only been stopped, it had been shattered. The sight of the Invincible Wehrmacht discarding its equipment and fleeing across the snowy wastes was a turning point that reverberated across the globe. The Battle of Moscow was more than just a tactical victory for the Red Army, it was the graveyard of Hitler's grand strategy. The German army would never truly recover from the losses in men and material suffered in the winter of 1941. The myth of the German Superman was buried in the snowdrifts outside the capital. The war would continue for 3 more bloody years, but the outcome was, in many ways, decided on the outskirts of Moscow. The systemic failure to respect the geography, the climate, and the sheer will of an opponent had led to a disaster of biblical proportions. As we look back at the ruins of Operation Typhoon, we see the profound irony of history. The very speed and success of the early German victories had blinded them to the reality of the task they had undertaken. They had mistaken a tactical advantage for a strategic certainty. The unsung heroes, the civilians in the trenches, the Siberian riflemen, and the logistical officers who kept the Soviet heart beating, proved that a nation's strength is not measured only by its machines, but by its ability to endure when all seems lost. The tragedy of Moscow remains a haunting reminder of the limits of power. The snow has long since melted, and the trenches have been filled, but the ghosts of the millions who fell there still whisper a warning about the cost of hubris. In the silence of the Russian winter, the lesson remains clear: no empire is so great that it cannot be humbled by the earth itself and the people who refuse to let it be taken. History does not move in straight lines, it turns on the pivot of a single moment, a single decision, or a single degree of temperature. The Battle of Moscow was the moment the world held its breath and realized that the darkness could be pushed back. It was the beginning of the end, a cold and bitter dawn that would eventually lead to the gates of Berlin. As the final echoes of the cannons fade into the past, we are left with the image of a city that stood firm, a symbol of defiance against an unstoppable tide, etched forever into the iron chronicle of human survival.
She was the pride of the Portsmouth Quay, the grandest cathedral to sail on the sea. With polished brass and the teak wood deck, she wore the sun like a gold-spun neck. But beneath the grace of her elegant stride, a fatal secret was locked deep inside. Built for speed, a hollow ghost, guarding the dream of a fading coast. The lessons of Jutland were cast to the gale, leaving a giant, fragile and frail. Oh, mighty Hood, the queen of the foam, the North Atlantic is now your home. A shell from the Bismarck, a pillar of light, tore through the silence of the morning mist bright, broken in two by the weight of her pride, the pride of the empire. Beneath the dark tide, the Bismarck waited, a wolf in the gray, while Holland gambled the light of the day, closing the distance to save her from fire. But the deck was a target, a funeral pyre. One single strike through the thin rusted plate sealed up the mission, decided the fate. The fire erupted, the magazines roared, 1,000 tons falling, the iron, the sword. Less than 3 minutes to fall to the deep, with 1,400 for the ocean to keep. Only 3 souls left to tell of the rain, of the oil on the water, the ghost of the pain. Now she rests in the dark, where the pressure holds fast, a relic of glory, a ghost of the past. No more the thunder, no more the parade, just the salt of the memory that never will fade. The watch is over, the ocean is wide, the queen of the seas lost to the tide.